Welcome to Loud Truth Trumpism in the United States. What happens when the leader of the United States openly calls the Prime Minister of Canada a future governor, not once, but repeatedly? Tonight, Donald Trump has reignited one of the most explosive diplomatic firestorms in modern North American history, mocking Mark Carney with the same humiliating language he once used against Justin Trudeau. The annexation threats are back, the 51st state rhetoric has returned with full force, and Ottawa is absolutely furious. What's really driving Trump's latest provocation, and why are Canadian officials warning that the diplomatic temperature between Washington and Ottawa hasn't been this dangerous in over a century? Stay with me because the details are stunning. I want to walk you through exactly what has unfolded over the past several days, because the situation between the United States and Canada has shifted in a way almost nobody anticipated. Just weeks ago, Prime Minister Mark Carney appeared on CNN with Christiane Amanpour during the NATO summit, and he told the world that President Trump was, in his words, no longer interested in annexing Canada. That statement carried weight. It suggested that the worst of the rhetoric was behind us, that the two leaders had reached some kind of quiet understanding, and that Canada could finally exhale after months of relentless pressure from the White House. But that calm has now completely shattered. President Trump has returned to calling Mark Carney the future governor of Canada, and he's not saying it once as a joke or a slip. He's saying it repeatedly, deliberately, and with full awareness of how deeply it cuts inside Ottawa. This is the same playbook Trump used during his first term when he mocked Justin Trudeau with the exact same governor framing. Back then, it was dismissed as theater. But now, in his second term, the language has taken on a much darker meaning because Trump has paired it with actual policy proposals, actual tariff threats, and actual incentives tied to American defense programs. And let me put this in perspective for you. In March of this year, Trump used the 51st state line as a bargaining chip during tariff negotiations. In May, he tied it directly to the Golden Dome Missile Defense Initiative, suggesting Canada could only benefit if it surrendered its sovereignty. And now, in the latest round of public statements, he's using it again, this time as a personal jab aimed squarely at destabilizing Carney's domestic political standing. Canadian officials have been tracking for public statements describe this as a coordinated psychological campaign, not casual commentary. Former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David L. Cohen, has openly stated that Trump knows the rhetoric irritates Canada and that he uses it precisely because it works as a pressure tool, and that it's a former American diplomat saying this on the record, which tells you how serious this moment really is. The implications stretch from Alberta to Quebec, from Wall Street to Bay Street, and from the halls of Parliament to every kitchen table in Canada where families are watching this unfold with growing anxiety. Before we dive deeper into the fallout, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you stay updated on this developing crisis. And in the next section, I'm going to break down exactly what Trump has proposed, what Carney has said in response, and why this confrontation is unlike anything we've seen before between these two historic allies. Now, let me take you inside the actual exchanges between Donald Trump and Mark Carney, because the words spoken between these two leaders reveal just how extraordinary this diplomatic crisis has become. Back in May, President Trump made a statement that stunned observers across both nations. He said, and I'm paraphrasing his public position carefully, that the only thing that truly made sense was for Canada to become America's cherished 51st state, and that if this happened, all tariffs and every other point of friction would simply disappear. That wasn't a throwaway line at a rally, that was a formal articulation of a policy preference from the sitting. The President of the United States directed at the sovereign nation immediately to his north. Mark Carney's response was, in my view, one of the most memorable diplomatic moments of the year. Sitting face to face with Trump inside the White House, Carney looked the president directly in the eye and said, there are some places that are never for sale, and that they were sitting in one of them right now. Think about that for a moment. The Prime Minister of Canada in the Oval Office telling the American president that his own country was not a piece of real estate, That single sentence has been replayed across Canadian television, shared millions of times on social media, and it has become a defining image of Carney's leadership. It captured something Canadians have been feeling for months, a deep instinctive refusal to be treated as a junior partner, or worse, as territory waiting to be absorbed. That moment in the Oval Office did not emerge from nowhere. It was the product of months of escalating tension, months of deliberate pressure from the White House, and months of Carney quietly building his own resolve in preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. And the world watched it happen in real time. The political consequences inside Canada have been nothing short of dramatic, and I want you to understand the scale of this shift. Trump's annexation rhetoric has pushed Canadian nationalism to record-breaking levels. In April 2026, Carney's Liberal Party won a stunning majority government, helped along by 5 opposition members crossing the floor to join the Liberals. And the Conservative Party, which had been polling competitively just a year earlier, has been crushed in public opinion. Carney's campaign slogan, "Elbows Up," borrowed directly from hockey culture and crafted as a direct response to Trump's threats, has transformed into a genuine national rallying cry. You hear it in coffee shops in St. John's, you hear it in pubs in Vancouver, you hear it from farmers in Saskatchewan. And here's something even more remarkable. Polling shows Mark Carney is significantly more popular than his predecessor, Justin Trudeau, including in conservative Alberta, which historically has been the toughest political terrain for any Liberal leader in modern Canadian history. The depth of that popularity is worth pausing on because it tells you something profound about what Trump's rhetoric has actually produced. Rather than fracturing Canadian society or demoralizing the public, the sustained pressure from Washington has done the opposite. It has unified a country that is often defined by its regional divides and competing political identities. From the Atlantic provinces to British Columbia, from the prairies to the urban centres of Ontario and Quebec, Canadians appear to be responding to this external threat with a solidarity that cuts across the usual fault lines of class, language, and geography. That is an extraordinary outcome, and it is one that the White House appears not to have anticipated. The assumption, if there was one, may have been that sustained economic and rhetorical pressure would weaken Carney's grip on power and make Canada more pliable at the negotiating table. Instead, what has happened is that Carney has been handed a political mandate that most prime ministers can only dream of, and he is using it to push back with a confidence that has surprised even some of his closest allies. The Elbows Up campaign is not simply a slogan. It is a crystallization of something deeper, a national mood that was already present but needed a moment and a leader to bring it fully into the open. But this is where the story gets genuinely concerning, and I want you to pay close attention to this part. Trump's renewed taunts are arriving at one of the most fragile moments Canada has faced in decades. The Alberta independence referendum is looming on the horizon, threatening to fracture the Canadian Federation in ways that would have been unthinkable just 2 years ago. So US Treasury officials have reportedly been meeting with Alberta separatist figures, which is an extraordinary diplomatic signal. Trade negotiations between Ottawa and Washington have stalled completely, and Carney's government is now operating under the assumption that Trump may be deliberately attempting to destabilize Canadian national unity in order to extract economic and strategic concessions. That is not a small accusation. That is a head of government suggesting that the President of the United States is actively working to weaken his country from within. And in the next section, I'm going to explain exactly how this strategy appears to be unfolding on the ground. Let me now unpack the strategic dimension of what Donald Trump is doing. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Throughout his second term, Trump has used the 51st state line not as a single isolated provocation, but as a recurring instrument deployed at very specific moments when he wants leverage over Canada. In March, when tariff negotiations between the two countries were at a critical juncture, the annexation rhetoric suddenly intensified. In May, when the United States was promoting the Golden Dome missile defense system and looking for partners and incentives, the rhetoric returned with even greater force. And now, with Alberta's independence referendum approaching and Mark Carney's government navigating delicate internal political dynamics, the rhetoric has come back yet again. This is not random. This is a tool, and Trump is using it with precision. The timing of each escalation aligns too neatly with moments of Canadian vulnerability for any of this to be coincidental. When Canada needed the United States to stand down, the pressure increased. When Canada needed diplomatic breathing room, the language grew sharper. And when Canada most needed its internal political landscape to remain stable, the American engagement with Alberta separatists began making headlines. Whether or not every element of this is deliberately orchestrated from the top, the cumulative effect is the same. Ottawa is being kept permanently off balance, and that is precisely where Trump's approach tends to work best. The former US ambassador to Canada, David L. Cohen, who served during the Biden administration, has been one of the clearest voices on this subject. He has publicly stated that Trump knows the rhetoric irritates Canada and that he uses it as a psychological weapon. Think about the weight of that statement. A former American ambassador, a man who spent years building bridges between Washington and Ottawa, is now telling the public that the current president is intentionally weaponizing language to pressure an allied democratic neighbor. And that is an extraordinary moment in the history of US-Canada relations. And it tells you how unusual this period really is. Canadian officials are not imagining the pressure. They are reading it correctly, and former American diplomats are confirming their reading. I want to focus your attention specifically on the Alberta situation, because this is where the danger becomes most acute. Alberta has long had a complicated relationship with Ottawa, rooted in disputes over energy policy, federal taxation, and regional representation. Now, with an independence referendum on the horizon, the province has become a pressure point that outside actors could potentially exploit. The reports of US Treasury officials meeting with Alberta separatists are particularly alarming because they suggest something far more serious than casual diplomatic curiosity. They suggest active engagement with figures who openly want to break Canada apart. Whether or not Trump personally directed those meetings, the optics alone are damaging. They communicate to the Carney government that no part of Canada's internal political landscape is off-limits to American interest. And that represents a significant departure from the traditional posture of mutual respect that has defined this relationship for generations. The signal being sent here is not subtle. It says that Washington views every fracture line within Canadian society as a potential opening, and that it is willing to engage with actors who would fundamentally alter the shape of the country. For Ottawa, this is not merely an irritant, it is a direct challenge to the integrity of the Federation, and it forces the Carney government to fight a two-front battle simultaneously, defending Canadian sovereignty against external pressure from the South, while also working to hold the country together from within. That is an enormous burden to place on any government, and the fact that Carney has managed to navigate it without losing public support is itself a remarkable political achievement. Now, I want to be careful and balanced here, because diplomacy is rarely as simple as one side being entirely right and the other being entirely wrong. Trump's defenders argue that his rhetoric is a negotiating style, that he uses provocation to extract better deals, and that Canada has often relied on the assumption of unlimited American goodwill without offering enough in return. There is a debate to be had about trade balances, defense contributions, and border policy. But what makes the current moment different is that the rhetoric has moved beyond economic negotiation and into territorial framing. when the president of one country repeatedly suggests that another country should cease to exist as a sovereign nation, even rhetorically, then that is no longer a negotiating tactic in the conventional sense that crosses into something Canadians experience as existential, and Carney's government is responding accordingly. In the next section, I'll examine how Canada is preparing its response, what tools Ottawa actually has, and why the elbows-up moment may define Carney's entire premiership. Now, let's talk about what Canada is actually doing in response, because Mark Carney's government is not simply absorbing these provocations passively. Ottawa has begun assembling a coordinated counter-strategy that operates on three simultaneous fronts: economic resilience, diplomatic outreach beyond Washington, and domestic unity. On the economic front, Canada has been quietly accelerating trade diversification, deepening relationships with European partners, expanding Indo-Pacific commercial ties, and reducing the country's dependence on the American market wherever possible. This is a long-term project, not a quick fix, and Carney himself has been transparent with the Canadian public that the transition will involve real economic costs, but the Prime Minister has framed those costs as the price of sovereignty. And so far, polling suggests the public is willing to pay it. And the willingness of Canadians to absorb economic disruption in defense of national independence is itself a significant political development, and it reflects the degree to which this crisis has reframed the national conversation. Sovereignty, once an abstract concept in the daily lives of most Canadians, has now become tangible and personal. People understand that the decisions being made in Ottawa and Washington right now will shape the kind of country Canada is for decades to come. And that understanding is driving a level of civic engagement that hasn't been seen in a very long time. Diplomatically, Canada has been working to strengthen its position within international institutions, particularly within the G7, NATO, and the broader network of democratic alliances. The strategy here is straightforward. If Washington is going to apply unconventional pressure, then Ottawa needs to ensure that the rest of the democratic world clearly understands what is happening and stands ready to defend the principle that sovereign borders are not negotiable between allies. European leaders have in various public statements expressed concern about the rhetoric coming out of the White House, and that international solidarity matters enormously to Canada's position. It transforms what could be an isolated bilateral confrontation into a broader question about the rules of the international order. And that is a much harder battlefield for any American administration to win on. Domestically, the Elbows Up campaign has evolved into something far larger than a political slogan. It has become a cultural movement across Canada. You see small businesses adopting the phrase, and athletes referencing it in interviews, and ordinary citizens using it in everyday conversation as shorthand for a collective refusal to be intimidated. That kind of organic adoption is rare in modern politics, and it gives Carney a reservoir of public support that very few prime ministers have ever enjoyed. If you want to keep following the latest on this geopolitical chess match, please subscribe to the YouTube channel now. The fact that this support extends into Alberta, traditionally the most skeptical province toward any Liberal government, is genuinely historic. It tells me that Canadians, regardless of region or political affiliation, are responding to the threat to national sovereignty before any other consideration. That unity is Carney's most valuable political asset, and his government knows it. However, I have to be honest with you about the limits of Canada's position, because no analysis is complete without acknowledging the structural realities. Canada's economy is deeply integrated with the American economy in ways that cannot be unwound quickly or painlessly. Energy exports, automotive manufacturing, agricultural supply chains, and financial services all flow across the border in volumes that make any rapid decoupling enormously costly. Canada also relies on the United States for elements of continental defense, intelligence sharing, and critical minerals partnerships. So, while the rhetoric of resistance is powerful and politically necessary, the practical reality is that Ottawa has to walk a very careful line between standing firm on sovereignty and avoiding actions that would inflict serious damage on Canadian families and Canadian workers. That balancing act, more than any single speech or summit, will define whether Carney's government emerges from this period stronger or weaker. And in the final section, I'll bring it all together and explain what happens next, what to watch for, and why this moment matters far beyond North America. So, where does this all go from here? That is the question I keep coming back to, and the honest answer is that we are in genuinely uncharted territory. The relationship between the United States and Canada has weathered disagreements before. There have been trade fights, there have been disputes over softwood lumber and dairy quotas, there have been moments of personal friction between presidents and prime ministers. But what we are watching now is fundamentally different. This is not a policy dispute. This is a confrontation over the basic question of whether Canada continues to exist as a sovereign nation in the way it has for over a century and a half. And that is why officials in Ottawa describe the diplomatic temperature as the hottest it has been in living memory. The next several months will be decisive. Watch the Alberta referendum carefully, because the result will reshape the political landscape regardless of which way the vote goes. If the independence movement loses decisively, Carney's hand strengthens enormously and Trump's leverage diminishes. If the result is closer than expected, or if the movement gains momentum afterward, then Ottawa faces an extraordinarily difficult internal challenge, while simultaneously managing external pressure from Washington. Watch the trade negotiations as well, because any breakthrough or breakdown there will signal the broader trajectory of the relationship. And watch Mark Carney's public communications, because the way he calibrates his tone when he chooses confrontation and when he chooses restraint, it will tell you a great deal about his read of the situation. I also want you to think about the broader implications, because this story matters far beyond the Canadian border. If a president of the United States can repeatedly suggest the absorption of an allied democratic nation without serious institutional pushback, that establishes a precedent that other countries around the world are watching very carefully. Allies in Europe, in Asia, and in Latin America are asking themselves what this kind of rhetoric means for their own relationships with Washington. And adversaries are watching to see whether the traditional norms of American diplomacy still hold, or whether the rules of international engagement are being rewritten in real time. The decisions Carney and Trump make in the coming months will echo far beyond Ottawa and Washington, and that is something every viewer should keep in mind as the story continues to unfold. The world is not simply observing this crisis from a safe distance. It is drawing active conclusions about what American leadership means in this era. And those conclusions will shape alliances, trade agreements, and defense arrangements for years to come. I'll leave you with one final thought before we close. Diplomacy, at its best, is built on the assumption that sovereignty is not a question to be reopened every few months by whoever happens to hold power. It is the foundation, not the bargaining chip. And when that foundation gets shaken, even rhetorically, the consequences ripple through every other aspect of the relationship, from defense cooperation to economic planning to cultural exchange. Mark Carney understands this. His elbows up posture is not just political branding. It is a recognition that some principles have to be defended publicly and consistently, even when the cost is high, because the alternative is a slow erosion that becomes impossible to reverse. Whether Carney succeeds in defending those principles and whether Trump eventually steps back from the annexation rhetoric will shape North America for a generation. The stakes couldn't be higher for the future of the continent. Every development in the next quarter will be critical to the survival of the current cross-border arrangement. As we watch these two leaders navigate this unprecedented friction, The global community is essentially observing a masterclass in modern power dynamics. It's no longer just about the 20% tariff or specific trade route. It's about the very identity of a G7 nation. The friction we're seeing today isn't just a bump in the road, it's a potential fork in the path for two of the world's most integrated economies. We've seen similar tensions in history, but rarely with this level of public intensity. From the Oval Office, as we continue to monitor the situation, it becomes clear that the strategy employed by the White House is designed to keep Ottawa off balance by constantly shifting the goalposts and reintroducing the 51st state narrative. The administration ensures that the Canadian government must spend a significant portion of its political capital simply reasserting its right to exist as an independent entity. This, in turn, may limit Carney's ability to focus on other pressing domestic issues, such as housing affordability or healthcare reform. It is a classic move from the Trump playbook. Dominate the news cycle and the diplomatic agenda with a statement. Mayhem, outrageous, that it forces the opponent into a defensive posture, and meanwhile, the undercurrents of the Alberta independence movement provide a perfect backdrop for this strategy. By engaging with separatist elements, even at a lower departmental level, the US sends a signal that the integrity of the Canadian Federation is not necessarily a priority for Washington. This puts immense pressure on Carney to maintain a unified front at home while simultaneously fighting a diplomatic war on the southern border. The coming weeks will likely see more high-stakes meetings and potentially more incendiary social media posts. The world will be watching to see if the elbows-up approach can actually hold the line against the neighbour that is 10 times larger in population and economy. This is a story of David and Goliath, but in a world of integrated supply chains and shared defense networks, the outcome will tell us a lot about the resilience of middle powers in an era of resurgent populism and America-first foreign policy. The nuances of these interactions are what define the modern era of international relations. If you appreciate this level of in-depth analysis on North American affairs, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel to help us grow. The historical context of this rift cannot be overstated. Since the War of 1812, the border between the United States and Canada has been famously the longest undefended border in the world. This peace has been the bedrock of North American prosperity. However, the current rhetoric threatens the psychological peace that allows such a border to exist, and when the conversation shifts toward annexation and future governors, the very idea of a friendly, sovereign neighbour is called into question. And this isn't just about Mark Carney or Donald Trump, it's about the legacy of decades of diplomatic labour that built the USMCA and various defence treaties. If that legacy is traded for short-term negotiating leverage, the long-term damage to the trust between these two nations could take decades to repair. We must also look at the economic data: over $2.6 billion in goods and services across that border every single day. Any significant disruption, whether through tariffs or a total breakdown in diplomatic relations, would be catastrophic for businesses in Michigan as much as in Ontario. The interdependency is so deep that a 51st state scenario, even if meant rhetorically, ignores the logistical reality of two distinct legal and social systems that have grown apart for 150 years. Carney's challenge is to remind his counterpart of this reality without appearing weak or subservient. It is a narrow path to walk. As we move into the final months of the year, the rhetoric will likely either boil over or reach a point of exhaustion. Either way, the map of North American diplomacy is being redrawn. Beyond the borders of North America, the global community is drawing its own conclusions. Middle powers like Australia, South Korea, and various European nations are looking at Canada as a bellwether. If the United States treats its closest neighbour and its largest trading partner with this level of unpredictability? What does it mean for them? The concept of friendshoring, the idea that countries should trade mostly with friendly allies, is being tested in real time. If the friend in question is suggesting you should no longer be an independent country, the logic of friendshoring begins to crumble. This is why Carney has been so active in the G7 and NATO circles. He is looking for a collective security that the bilateral relationship no longer seems to guarantee. The elbows up strategy is as much about signal sending to the world as it is to Washington. It says that Canada is a rule of law nation that will not be bullied by the whims of any single administration. It also highlights the importance of the Alberta situation. The provincial friction is a domestic Canadian issue, but in the hands of a clever foreign negotiator, it becomes a lever. The stability of the Canadian Federation is now a matter of international concern. Every speech given in the Alberta legislature is being analysed in Washington for potential openings. Every response from Ottawa is being weighed for its strength and resolve. We are witnessing a new kind of Cold War of words, where the prize isn't at global ideology, but sovereign control and economic dominance. In conclusion, the path forward remains clouded with uncertainty. We are seeing a fundamental shift in how the United States interacts with its allies, moving from a consensus-based model to one based on power and provocation. Mark Carney's response has been to lean into a renewed sense of Canadian identity, using the elbows up moniker to unite a diverse and often divided country. Whether this will be enough to withstand the pressure from a second Trump term remains to be seen. The Alberta referendum will be a major turning point, and the trade negotiations will provide the necessary data points to see if any real progress is being made. For now, the world watches and waits. The 51st state rhetoric may be a tactic, a joke, or a genuine desire, but for Canadians, it is a challenge that requires a firm and consistent answer. The bond between these two nations is too important to be broken by a few years of high-tension rhetoric, yet it is too fragile to be taken for granted. We will continue to track every development, every statement, and every shift in this historic confrontation. Thank you so much for watching our coverage on the renewed tensions between Trump and Carney over Canada's sovereignty. If you found this breakdown valuable, please subscribe to the channel, Loud Truth, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest reports on the stories shaping our world. See you in the next one. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join our community here at Loud Truth.